When I first met Brian, I thought he was the perfect man. His charming smile, magnetic personality, and unyielding ambition were captivating. As we stood at the altar, exchanging vows, I believed with all my heart that we were destined for a happy, long life together. But as the years passed, cracks in our perfect life began to form, small, nearly invisible at first, but growing larger with each passing day. Looking back, I wonder if it was my naivete that blinded me to the signs. Brian's demands for perfection, his obsession with appearances, his jealousy masked as protectiveness, they all seemed so small at first, but those tiny details would soon culminate into a nightmare I would never have imagined. It all began when Brian's work began to consume him. He'd always been a dedicated man, but lately, he became more obsessive, distant, and unapproachable. He spent countless nights at the office or on work trips. I didn't think much of it, I trusted him implicitly. But I started noticing odd changes in his behavior. He was no longer the sweet man I'd married. He became critical, always pointing out flaws in my appearance or attitude. And then came the demands. It wasn't enough for me to be his wife anymore. Brian wanted me to be more than that. At first, it started with harmless fantasies, sharing intimate details of our private moments with him when he was away, sending photos. I indulged him because I thought it would bring us closer. I had no idea I was feeding a darker desire within him. One evening after Brian returned from a long business trip, he sat me down with an odd look in his eyes. His voice was unusually calm, which sent a shiver down my spine. I'd been thinking a lot, he began, about us, about how to make our marriage stronger. I tried to reassure him, thinking he was simply stressed. We're fine. Brian, every couple goes through rough cheese. But he shook his head, an eerie smile playing on his lips. No, I think I've found a solution. Something that will change everything for the better. That's when he dropped the bombshell. He wanted me to expand our relationship. He explained that he'd been reading various Reddit forums about open relationships, alternative lifestyles, and other things that couples supposedly did to reignite their passion. He believed that by introducing others into our marriage, we'd be stronger, closer, more connected. My stomach turned at the thought. At first, I laughed, thinking he was joking. Are you serious, Brian? You want us to cheat on each other to save our marriage? He wasn't amused by my reaction. His expression hardened. It's not cheating if it's consensual. This will be good for us, good for you. I know what's best. I protested, but Brian wasn't having it. The calm, calculated manner in which he explained his plan terrified me. He wasn't asking me. He was telling me what was going to happen. In the weeks that followed, Brian became more insistent. Every conversation led back to his twisted idea of strengthening our marriage. He'd bring up stories from Reddit, twisting them to justify his demands. Look at these couples. They're happy. This could be us if you weren't so stubborn. The pressure was relentless. He became emotionally distant when I refused, leaving me to feel isolated and guilty. I started doubting myself, wondering if I was being unreasonable, if maybe this was something other couples did, and I was just being closed-minded. But then, things took a darker turn. One evening, I came home from running errands to find Brian waiting for me in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked smug, his eyes glinting with a sinister excitement I'd never seen before. I have a surprise for you, he said, his voice dripping with anticipation. Before I could ask what he meant, 3 men walked into the room. I didn't recognize any of them, but the way they looked at me sent a wave of dread coursing through my body. They were young, probably in their late 20s, fit and wearing expressions that made my skin crawl. Brian smiled, clearly pleased with my reaction. This is what I've been talking about, he said casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. These men are here for you. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked at him, horrified. What are you talking about? Are you insane? But Brian didn't flinch. He moved closer to me, lowering his voice so only I could hear. You're going to do this whether you like it or not. This is what's going to save our marriage. You owe this to me. I felt sick, betrayed. The man I had loved, trusted, and shared my life with was now forcing me into something unimaginable. I wanted to scream, to run, but the look in Brian's eyes made it clear that I had no choice. This was no longer a request, it was a command. The 3 men stood there, watching, waiting for Brian's signal. I felt trapped, my mind racing for a way out, but there was none. Brian had orchestrated everything perfectly. He knew I wouldn't leave him, at least, not yet. He had broken me down emotionally to the point where I didn't even recognize myself anymore. I was a shell of the woman I used to be, too scared to fight back. That night was the worst of my life. The details are too painful to recount, but the humiliation, the betrayal, and the feeling of being powerless in my own home have left scars that will never heal. Brian watched the entire time, his face a mixture of satisfaction and perverse delight. He didn't just want this to happen, he needed it to happen. It was his way of controlling me, of breaking me completely. When it was over, I lay in bed, numb and broken, while Brian acted as if nothing had happened. He kissed me goodnight, telling me how much he loved me, as if that would erase the horror of what had just taken place. In the days that followed, Brian was more attentive than ever. He acted like a doting husband, cooking meals, buying me gifts, and planning romantic evenings. It was as if he thought that by being good to me afterward, he could erase the trauma. But I couldn't forget. Every time I looked at him, I saw the monster behind the mask. I couldn't stay silent any longer. I reached out to a close friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in months, because Brian had isolated me from everyone in my life. I told her everything, the abuse, the coercion, and what he had forced me to do. She was horrified and immediately offered her support. Together, we devised a plan for me to leave Brian once and for all. It wasn't easy. Brian had control over every aspect of our lives, financially, emotionally, and even physically. But with my friend's help, I was able to gather enough courage to escape. I filed for divorce and sought therapy to deal with the emotional scars he had left behind. It's been a long, painful journey, but I'm slowly reclaiming my life. I've shared my story on Reddit in hopes that other women who may be in similar situations can see that they're not alone. The responses have been overwhelming, messages of support, encouragement, and others sharing their own experiences of betrayal and abuse. Brian tried to contact me several times after I left, but I've cut all ties. I've blocked him on every platform, changed my number, and moved to a different city. He no longer has any power over me. As I sit here writing this, I realize how far I've come. The woman who once felt trapped, scared, and broken is slowly rebuilding herself. I'm learning to trust again, to believe that not all men are like Brian, and that I deserve love, respect, and kindness. Betrayal cuts deep, especially when it comes from the person you thought would never hurt you. But with time, I've learned that the strength to move on comes from within. No one has the right to control your life, your body, or your choices. I wish I had realized that sooner, but I'm grateful that I found the courage to leave before it was too late. This story isn't just about betrayal, it's about survival. And for anyone out there who may be reading this, remember, you are stronger than you think. You are not alone. The first few months after I left Brian were a blur. I was filled with conflicting emotions: anger, sadness, relief, and guilt. Therapy helped me work through the tangled mess inside my mind, but every day was still a battle. I often found myself second-guessing my decision, wondering if I had somehow exaggerated the situation. Brian had done such a thorough job of manipulating me, planting seeds of doubt in mine that would take years to fully uproot. The messages I received on Reddit were a lifeline. Complete strangers who had read my story reached out with empathy and understanding, assuring me that I had done the right thing by leaving. Some of their stories were even more horrifying than mine, and it made me realize just how common betrayal and abuse are in relationships. I wasn't alone, and that knowledge was both comforting and terrifying. How many other women, right at this moment, were trapped in the same nightmare I had escaped from? The legal process of divorce was drawn out and painful. Brian fought me at every turn, trying to manipulate me into coming back. He'd send me long emails filled with apologies and promises of change, but they were empty words. His cruelty and control were laid bare in those messages, masked as regret. He couldn't accept that I had taken back the power he once held over me. During one particularly difficult night, I decided to return to Reddit to update my story. I needed to vent, to let the world know what was happening. As I typed, the words flowed more easily than I had expected, pouring out of me like poison being drained from a wound. I told the community about the legal battles, the manipulative emails, and the constant fear that he might show up at my door. When I posted the update, the response was immediate. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. People shared their own stories of enduring similar betrayals, offering advice and encouragement. Some even sent resources for legal help and trauma recovery. One user in particular stood out to me. She had been in a similar situation with her ex-husband and had managed to rebuild her life after years of abuse. Her words struck a chord. It will never be easy, but every day you take another step forward. And those small steps add up. One day you'll look back and realize you're miles away from the person you used to be. Her message stayed with me. I read it over and over, letting it sink in. That was the turning point for me. I had survived the worst of it, but I hadn't truly started living again. I was still letting the trauma define me, letting Brian's betrayal dictate my future. But her words reminded me that healing was a journey, not a destination. I didn't have to be okay right away. I just had to keep moving forward. Slowly, I started to reclaim my life. I threw myself into work, taking on more projects and challenging myself in ways I hadn't before. It was an escape at first, but eventually I found joy in it. I had forgotten what it felt like to succeed, to accomplish something on my own without Brian's shadow looming over me. For the first time in years, I was proud of myself. I also reconnected with old friends, the ones Brian had driven away. Some of them had drifted too far, but others welcomed me back with open arms. They hadn't understood what I had been going through at the time, but now they saw the full picture. We spent long nights catching up, reminiscing, and laughing about old times. It felt like I was rediscovering parts of myself I had lost during my marriage. There were still hard days. Sometimes I would have nightmares about that night with the three men. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as the memories flooded back. I worked through those moments in therapy, talking about the shame, the guilt, and the helplessness. My therapist helped me see that what happened wasn't my fault. Brian had manipulated and coerced me, and I had done what I needed to survive. It took a long time to accept that truth, but little by little I started to let go of the blame I had been carrying. As the months passed, I began to open myself up to the idea of new relationships. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just someone to remind me that not all men were like Brian. I joined a few online dating apps, cautiously dipping my toes back into the world of romance. The first few dates were awkward and uncomfortable. I found myself on edge, constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. But I reminded myself that these men weren't Brian, and I didn't have to carry the weight of my past into every interaction. Eventually, I met someone. His name was Lucas, and he was everything Brian wasn't: kind, patient, and understanding. We took things slow, and I told him early on about my past. I was terrified he would run, but instead he listened without judgment. He didn't push me to move faster than I was ready, and for the first time in years, I felt safe. Lucas helped me see that love didn't have to be painful, that relationships could be built on trust and respect. It was a revelation. We spent long hours talking, walking through the park, and enjoying simple moments together. He showed me that life could be peaceful, that I didn't have to live in a constant state of anxiety or fear. I began to open up more, sharing parts of myself I hadn't even realized I had closed off. Our relationship wasn't perfect, and I still had moments where my past crept in. There were times when I'd flinch at certain touches or feel a wave of panic out of nowhere. But Lucas was patient. He never made me feel ashamed for my trauma. Instead, he stood by me, helping me navigate the triggers and reminding me that healing wasn't linear. As time went on, I started to feel lighter. The dark cloud that had hung over me for so long began to dissipate. I could laugh again, genuinely and without reservation. I could look in the mirror and see someone I recognized, someone strong and resilient. The woman who had once been shattered was piecing herself back together. One day, I decided to go back to Reddit and post a final update. It had been nearly 2 years since I had left Brian, and while the scars were still there, they no longer defined me. I wanted to share my story with those who had followed my journey from the beginning, to show them that it was possible to come out the other side. I wrote about the small victories, finding joy in my work, reconnecting with old friends, and opening myself up to love again. I talked about the dark days too, because they were still a part of my story. But most importantly, I wrote about the hope that had returned to my life, the sense of possibility that I thought I had lost forever. The response was overwhelming. People who had followed my story from the beginning reached out with words of congratulations and encouragement. Some shared their own stories of recovery, while others simply thanked me for being brave enough to share mine. It was a reminder that, even in the darkest moments, we are never truly alone. Looking back on everything now, I realized that Brian's betrayal was a turning point in my life. It shattered me in ways I never could have imagined, but it also forced me to confront my own strength. I had survived something terrible, something that no one should ever have to endure. And in surviving, I had learned what I was capable of. I'm not the same person I was before Brian. I'm stronger now, more resilient, and more aware of my worth. I know what I deserve in a relationship, and I will never settle for anything less. Betrayal may have broken me, but it didn't destroy me. It made me into the woman I am today: a survivor, a fighter, and someone who will never again let anyone take away her power. For anyone reading this, whether you're going through something similar or have faced your own betrayals, know this: you are stronger than you think. No one has the right to control you, to force you into situations you don't want, or to make you feel small. And no matter how deep the betrayal, you can rise above it. It won't be easy, but every step forward is a victory. This is my story, but it's also a reminder that there is life after betrayal. There is hope, there is healing, and there is love waiting for you if you're brave enough to take the first step forward. As I moved further into my new life, I began to notice more profound changes in myself. With every passing day, the weight of my past loosened its grip on me, though the shadows of that dark chapter were always present, lurking quietly in the corners of my mind. My life, once defined by betrayal and manipulation, was now shaped by a journey of healing and self-discovery. Lucas remained a constant, steadfast presence. While I still hesitated to use words like forever or soulmate, I knew what we had was genuine. His love wasn't the kind that swept me off my feet in a dramatic whirlwind. It was quiet, steady, and reassuring. He understood the delicate balance I was trying to maintain between embracing the present and healing from the past. In so many ways, he represented the life I never thought I could have. It wasn't just Lucas, though. My sense of self had shifted. The parts of me that Brian had tried to break, the parts that had been scared, hesitant, or too trusting, were now sharper, more aware. I had boundaries. I wasn't afraid to say no, to assert myself, and to defend my space. I had learned, painfully, that love isn't submission, and trust must be earned and maintained, not blindly given. There were moments when I would reflect on how far I had come, and I would feel a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride for surviving and rebuilding, but sorrow for the time lost, the years wasted with someone who never deserved me in the first place. There were flashes of anger too, directed at Brian, but also at myself for not seeing the red flags sooner, for allowing myself to be manipulated. Yet, as my therapist often reminded me, hindsight is always clearer, and blaming myself only perpetuated the wounds I was trying to heal. One evening, after a particularly emotional therapy session, I sat down to journal, a practice I had picked up to help process the complex emotions I was navigating. I wrote about my past, about Brian, about the night he forced me into the unimaginable with those 3 men. I didn't shy away from the details. I poured every raw, unfiltered emotion onto the pages. The shame, the fear, the overwhelming sense of powerlessness. It was painful but necessary. Writing it down helped me release it, little by little. It didn't change what happened, but it allowed me to reclaim my narrative. For so long, Brian had controlled my story. Now, it was mine again. Around the same time, I started considering going public with my story, not just on Reddit, but in a more formal way. I had received countless messages from women who had faced similar situations, women who had been trapped in relationships where they were manipulated, coerced, and betrayed. Some had escaped like I had, but many were still searching for a way out, uncertain of their strength, unsure if they would ever be free. I thought about writing a book, a memoir of sorts, about my journey. It was a daunting idea, and at first, I wasn't sure if I was ready to expose that part of myself to the world in such a vulnerable way. But the more I reflected on the impact my story had already had on others through Reddit, the more I realized how powerful storytelling could be. If sharing my experiences could help even one woman escape a toxic relationship, it would be worth it. Lucas supported the idea wholeheartedly. He knew how important it was for me to take ownership of my story and use it as a force for good. "You've already come so far," he said one night as we lay in bed, the soft glow of the moon casting gentle shadows across the room. "Your story can change lives. You've survived something unimaginable, and now you have the power to help others survive too." His words resonated deeply with me. That's when I decided to go for it. I started drafting chapters in my free time, revisiting the memories that, while painful, were an integral part of the story I wanted to tell. I included everything: the good, the bad, and the ugly. My love for Brian in the early days, the subtle manipulation, the gradual erosion of my confidence, and the night that shattered everything. I also wrote about the aftermath: leaving him, the therapy, the loneliness, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding my life. Writing the book was cathartic, but it was also hard. Some days I had to stop after just a few sentences, overwhelmed by the weight of the memories. Other days I would write for hours, the words flowing out of me like a flood, unstoppable and relentless. There were moments of doubt where I questioned whether anyone would want to read my story, or if I was just reopening old wounds for nothing. But Lucas, my therapist, and my friends kept me grounded, reminding me that my story mattered not just to me, but to others who might need to hear it. As the book took shape, I began to feel a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in a long time. My suffering wasn't in vain. It was leading me to something bigger, something meaningful. I was turning my pain into power, and that realization was liberating. During this time, Brian tried to reach out to me again. He had somehow heard about my writing project, whether through mutual acquaintances or social media, I wasn't sure. He sent me a series of messages, alternating between threats and pleas. He accused me of trying to destroy his life, of fabricating stories to make myself look like a victim. In the same breath, he begged me to take him back, claiming he had changed, that he realized now how wrong he had been. I didn't respond. I had no intention of engaging with him or allowing him back into my life in any capacity. I forwarded the messages to my lawyer, who was still handling the final stages of the divorce, and blocked Brian's number. The man who had once controlled every aspect of my life no longer had any power over me. His words, once so manipulative and devastating, now fell flat. As the months passed, the book neared completion. I began the process of finding a publisher, and to my surprise, there was a significant amount of interest. It turned out that stories of survival, of betrayal and resilience resonated with people. One particular publisher seemed like a perfect fit. They were known for publishing memoirs that tackled difficult subjects with honesty and grace. After a few meetings, I signed a contract, and my book, tentatively titled Surviving the Betrayal, was set for release the following year. The sense of accomplishment I felt was indescribable. I had taken something horrific, something that had nearly destroyed me, and turned it into something that might help others heal. I had turned the page on that chapter of my life, but I hadn't closed the book. Instead, I was sharing it with the world, hoping that my story would inspire others to find the strength to leave toxic relationships, to believe in their own resilience, and to know that they were not alone. In the months leading up to the book's release, I received messages from women who had read early drafts or excerpts. They thanked me for my honesty, for not sugarcoating the pain, and for showing them that it was possible to survive even the darkest moments. Many of them were still in abusive or controlling relationships, and my heart broke for them. But I also felt hope, because by sharing my story I was helping them see that there was a way out. The day the book was released was a whirlwind. It felt surreal, seeing my name on the cover, knowing that my story was out in the world for anyone to read. There was fear, of course, the fear of being judged, of being vulnerable on such a public stage. But there was also pride. I had done something important. I had taken my pain and used it to create something that could help others heal. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Reviews poured in, many from women who had gone through similar experiences, thanking me for giving them a voice. The book sparked conversations about emotional abuse, manipulation, and coercion, topics that were often ignored or downplayed in society. I was invited to speak on podcasts, at women's shelters, and even at a few literary events. Each time I shared my story, I felt a little bit stronger, a little more whole. But the most important outcome was the personal messages I received from readers. Women, sometimes even men, would write to me, telling me how my book had given them the courage to leave abusive relationships or to seek help. They shared their stories of betrayal, of feeling trapped, and of finding the strength to move forward. It was a reminder that our stories have power, that sharing our truth can create ripples of change in the lives of others. Looking back on everything now, I see that the betrayal I endured wasn't the end of my story. It was the catalyst for a new beginning. It broke me, yes, but it also gave me the opportunity to rebuild myself stronger, wiser, and more resilient.